Hello, and welcome to the NAMB webinar on privacy and confidentiality. Protecting and upholding client privacy and confidentiality is a fundamental responsibility of every nurse in every practice setting. For this reason, this year's CCP mandatory learning module will focus on the overarching elements of privacy and demonstrate the accountabilities and responsibilities of nurses in protecting and upholding privacy and confidentiality. This webinar is approximately 15 minutes in length. Before we begin, NAMB would like to acknowledge that our office is located on the traditional territory of the Wolastoqiyik, and that all NAMB interactions take place on unsurrendered and unceded lands of the Wolastoqiyik, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy, as outlined in the Treaties of Peace and Friendship. Today, we will review important definitions, the nurse's responsibilities for upholding privacy and confidentiality, access, collection, and use of personal health information, disclosure and sharing of personal health information, safeguarding personal health information, and breaches in privacy and maintaining privacy. Personal health information, or PHI, is defined as any identifying information about an individual. This comprises everything that an organization holds in its records about an individual, which may include name, age, race, address, or identifying numbers or symbols. Privacy can be defined as physical or informational. Physical privacy relates to an individual's right to control or limit access to oneself. Informational privacy is the right of an individual to determine how, when, with whom, and for what purposes any of their PHI is shared. Confidentiality is the ethical obligation to keep an individual's PHI secret or private. Nurses must keep a client's PHI private and only share information as needed with authorized individuals or organizations. A custodian is the legal term used to encompass all individuals or organizations that collect, maintain, or use personal health information for the purpose of providing or assisting in the provision of healthcare or treatment, the planning and management of the healthcare system, or delivering a program or service. Custodians are responsible for ensuring PHI is safeguarded, accessed, collected, used, and disclosed according to legislation. Nurses have several legal, professional, and ethical obligations related to privacy and confidentiality. These obligations are set out in legislation, standards of practice, practice guidelines, and the Code of Ethics for registered nurses. Federal and provincial legislation uphold and protect a person's right to privacy and confidentiality regarding their PHI. The specific legislation that applies to an individual nurse's practice is dependent upon their work setting. It is the responsibility of each nurse to know which legislation applies to their practice and to follow legislated requirements. In New Brunswick, the Personal Health Information Privacy and Access Act provides a set of rules that protect PHI. Federally, the Privacy Act is the law that determines privacy rights within federal government institutions. Standards are authoritative statements that articulate the conduct required of graduate nurses, registered nurses, and nurse practitioners. All nurses are accountable to the standards related to maintaining privacy and upholding confidentiality, which can be found in the standards of practice for registered nurses, the standards for the nurse-client relationship, and the standards for documentation. Moreover, nurses are also obligated to adhere to the Code of Ethics for registered nurses, which outlines the ethical responsibilities that nurses have in safeguarding personal, family, and community information obtained in the context of a professional relationship. Guidelines identify principles, give instructions, information, or direction, clarify roles and responsibilities, and or provide a framework for decision making. The practice guideline for privacy and confidentiality is intended to be used as a resource for nurses in all practice settings to understand their responsibilities related to privacy and confidentiality, as well as various aspects of accessing, collecting, using, and disclosing PHI. Finally, nurses are responsible for understanding and following employer policy related to privacy and confidentiality in their specific practice environment. If a nurse is self employed, then they are frequently considered the legal custodian of PHI and are required to develop policies and procedures that adhere to the appropriate legislation, standards, and code of ethics. More information is available in NAMB's guideline for self employed practice. When nurses access, collect, or use PHI, they must do so only for reasons that meet their professional responsibilities or legislated requirements. Only access PHI that relates directly to and is necessary for the healthcare service, program, or activity. Only collect the health information that is reasonably necessary to meet the client's healthcare needs. Only use the PHI for the purpose for which it was collected, unless the client consents that it can be used for another purpose, and confirm that the client or substitute decision maker has consented to the collection, use, and disclosure of PHI. When nurses share or disclose PHI, they must ensure it is limited to the minimal amount of necessary information to accomplish the purpose for which it was disclosed, and only share PHI on a reasonable need to know basis with other members of the healthcare team. Those not directly involved in a client's care may be required to access PHI for activities such as supporting practice, educational opportunities, or quality assurance. Nurses have an ethical obligation when discussing clinical cases to not identify clients unless necessary and appropriate. If identification is necessary, then nurses should consider if there is authorized consent from the client and follow employer policy related to sharing information with healthcare professionals not directly involved in client care. There are a few exceptions when disclosure of PHI without consent is necessary. Examples include public health legislation, child protection legislation, mental health legislation, other mandatory reporting legislation, or when the nurse reasonably believes sharing information is necessary to prevent the risk of serious harm to an individual to whom the information relates. It is important to understand employer policy related to disclosure of PHI without consent and to first consult with the employer's privacy officer or legal counsel, such as the Canadian Nurses Protective Society, to follow correct processes related to these exceptional circumstances. Custodians are responsible for protecting PHI by adopting information practices that include reasonable administrative, technical, and physical safeguards, as well as cybersecurity measures that ensure the confidentiality, security, accuracy, and integrity of the information. Administrative safeguards may include policies or procedures for security breach incidents or security training for employees. Technical safeguards may include resetting passwords frequently, dual factor authentication, or automatic closing of a session with no activity. Physical safeguards may include passwords to access digital information or locks on physical storage locations where charts or other information is kept. Cybersecurity may include continuing education for staff to better understand phishing emails or apps with encrypted messaging to communicate amongst the team via cell phone. Regardless of the type of safeguarding implemented, it is important for nurses to understand employer policy and to follow employer policy to ensure the integrity and safety of PHI. Nurses who are self employed are responsible for reviewing and understanding best practices related to safeguarding of PHI and implementing these into their self employed practice. Breaches in privacy can happen when the PHI of a client is shared to a third party without their consent. Breaches may be intentional or unintentional. They can include, for example, sharing information about a client to others who are not a part of the healthcare team, accessing, collecting, or using information for purposes that are inconsistent with their professional obligations, accessing client records when the nurse is not a part of the healthcare team, mishandling photos or videos of clients receiving care, and misdirecting information to the wrong fax or email address. Breaches in privacy or unauthorized access, collection, use, or disclosure of PHI can lead to multiple consequences. They can include, but are not limited to, a client pursuing legal action against a nurse for breach of confidentiality or privacy, NAMB investigating a complaint and instituting disciplinary proceedings, the employer launching an investigation and disciplinary action, the New Brunswick Ombuds Office investigating a complaint, negative impact on the nurse-client relationship, and increased stress or embarrassment for the client. Nurses have the responsibility to maintain the privacy of their clients and uphold confidentiality. There are many ways that nurses can ensure this, which include placing the client's privacy first when making any decisions about access, collection, use, or disclosure of PHI. If a situation is unclear, err on the side of caution and reach out to their employer's privacy officer, the New Brunswick Ombuds Office, or their nursing regulator. Following employer policy and advocating for the development of policies as needed, never discussing confidential information in public areas, and never attempting to gain access to PHI outside of employment duties. This includes reviewing records out of curiosity or searching the health information of friends, family members, or their own information. To support understanding of the nurse's responsibilities on privacy and confidentiality, NAMB has developed and published a practice guideline on this topic. This guideline can be found on the NAMB website. If you have any questions related to the application of this information to your practice, or for any other questions related to your practice, please contact NAMB by email at practiceconsultation@namb.mb.ca. Thank you.